Dr. Arendt is the chair of the MSU Billings Department of History and has been on the faculty there for 9 years. She holds a bachelor's and master's in history from the University of Wyoming and a PhD in early American history from the Ohio State University. Her forthcoming articles, she has one coming out in Early American Studies on fashion and the Panic of 1819, and in the winter edition of Montana, the Magazine of Western History, she will have an article on her topic. So please join me. Please join me in welcoming Professor Emily Arendt to tell us about her research on the 1977 Women's International Year Conference.
Well, good morning, everybody. Is this mic distance working for us? Okay. Well, thank you all for showing up bright and early. I know 7:30 is a big ask on a Saturday morning, so I'm really delighted to see this turnout. And I also want to take a moment to extend my gratitude to the Montana Historical Society, and particularly the staff in the archives there who made my experience researching this topic just truly remarkable. I mean, I've spent time in archives all across the country, and it's not an understatement to say I've never had such a welcoming, friendly, helpful group of people there to assist me. So major, major thank you to them. Yes. I also want to thank a group of students that I worked with 2 years ago at Montana State University Billings that kind of led me to this project. You might have noticed from my introduction that I'm predominantly a historian of the early American Republic. I focus on gender and politics from the American Revolution through the 1840s. So this is a bit of a divergence for me professionally. But I was approached by a group of scholars funded by a National Endowment for the Humanities grant that are working on collecting biographies of all the delegates to the 1977 National Women's Conference. And it's truly a wonderful program that they've developed, that they are publishing these biographies. It's the Sharing Stories of 1977 website, if you want to check it out. But they're working with university faculty to work with students to do the research and write these biographies themselves. And so it was through working with students in our sophomore methods class that I got introduced to this topic and was fascinated by the big controversy that erupted surrounding this topic here in Montana. And, I'll also say, I can't imagine a better place to be delivering this talk. Not only was Helena the site of the State Women's Conference in 1977, but this very hotel is really the work of Betty Babcock. Betty Babcock, the wife of Governor Tim Babcock, and one of the key players that I'm going to be talking about today. So it really feels special to be giving this talk in this room today. Okay, so one of the things that I've also been really interested in is how forgotten the 1977 National Women's Conference is in popular memory. So for some of the people who participated, this was clearly a formative event. But in terms of popular memory, I asked my parents about it, I asked other folks about it, and they're like, oh, yeah, kind of remember that, but they don't really have a whole lot of details. In fact, when I went through the participant list of all 1,787 people who convened in Helena for the conference, I saw a couple of names I knew on that list, and I called one guy up. I'm like, Howard, you were there. Tell me about it. And he's like, no, my girlfriend dragged me to all that stuff. I don't remember anything about it. So okay, thanks, Howard. So just to start with a little bit of background about the National Women's Conference. So this emerged out of a United Nations conference in 1975, which was dubbed International Women's Year. It was held in Mexico City and resulted in the adoption of a so-called World Plan of Action. And one of the points was that nations all across the globe should dedicate time and resources to investigating the status of women in their own country. President Gerald Ford issued an executive order creating a national commission on the observance of International Women's Year. And Patsy Mink and Bella Abzug introduced legislation into Congress to allocate $5 million to establish a National Women's Conference, to fund 56 pre-conferences in all states and territories, to really try to dig into the diversity of issues impacting women in the country. To that end, the National Commission issued a pamphlet to form a more perfect union, where they laid out 16 suggested resolutions that they hoped the state and territorial pre-conferences would take up as beginning points for conversation. Keep this in mind, this is going to come back up. Now, context matters, so let's talk a little bit about what's happening in Montana in the 1970s. As many of you know, 1972, a pivotal year for women and for the state and for politics, and women's politics in the state. 19 of the 100 delegates to the Constitutional Convention were women. They were part of this process that resulted in the passage of what's potentially the most inclusive equal rights clause of any known constitution to date. Many of you know this, right? So it included prohibitions against discrimination against protected classes of people, on the basis of race, color, sex, culture, social origin, all of these kinds of things. And so the inclusion of the word sex in this provision is really remarkable, because this is also a moment where the nation is embroiled in controversy about the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment. First introduced in 1923, the Equal Rights Amendment simply stated that equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex. Right? It's kind of a bigger protection, a national protection of what was already enshrined in the state constitution. There was some controversy in Montana, stoked by anti-ERA forces in the state, but ultimately it became the 32nd state to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. This is really part and parcel of a trend that we see nationwide coming out of the second wave feminist movements of the 1960s and 1970s, where there's a lot of emphasis on investigating the causes of women's inferior status in the country. And in Montana, you see the same things that are happening nationwide, that women are more interested in getting involved in politics to try to end the de jure discrimination that they'd faced in legal and political systems. So Dorothy Bradley in 1971 talked about this in a speech in the House of Representatives, where she said, "The need for more women in the legislative process is a serious one because the number of issues which lie in the realm of women. These issues are dealt with by the legislature at a time when it's only outdated tradition that has made men the decision makers. If women are dissatisfied, they must simply show more faces for the final vote." And more faces they did show. In the 1970s, the number of women in the state legislature increases, 9 in the 73 session, up to 14 in the 75 and 77 sessions. And together, these women work to pass a bundle of laws that really liberalize a lot of the legislation in the state, including liberalized divorce laws, including provisions for irreconcilable differences as a reason for divorce. We also see the implementation of acts preventing sexual discrimination in the workplace, including laws preventing employers from firing pregnant women. We also see work improving the inclusivity of legal language, which did things like allowed women to be legally recognized as the head of household. We also see work requiring institutions to provide equal credit opportunities to people. I'd also just take a moment to note that not all women involved in state politics are part of this progressive, feminist, liberal tradition. Some, including Betty Babcock, really push conservative agendas. There's pushback against the Equal Rights Amendment. There's some pretty wild swings in the state legislature on the issue of abortion in the 1970s. But overall, I think that you really see greater attention to women's issues and the creation of bureaucratic entities to address those things. So, by 1976, the National Commission on the Observation of International Women's Year began the process of creating state-level commissions to implement those state pre-conferences. Mary Munger, who's probably best known as the longtime director of the Montana Nurses Association, was appointed chairperson of the Montana IWY Coordinating Committee, which began meeting in December of 1976 in order to plan the state conference. They'd been awarded $25,000 from the National Commission to plan this, to develop the structure for the statewide organizations, to come up with the issues that were important, the kinds of committees that they would need to appoint regional coordinators for all of these task forces, that ultimately would lead to the state conference, where they would formulate resolutions and elect delegates to represent the state of Montana at the National Women's Conference. So here you can see a draft of the map for the region. So again, before the state conference, there were 6 regional conferences that were going to be held to try to get out the word about International Women's Year and associated activities, to assess the status of women in Montana and identify common concerns to bring to the state convention, and to make recommendations. They also recognized that many women in the state would be unable to travel as far as Helena, and so it was really hoped that having these regional conferences would bring more voices to the table. They went about publicizing these pre-conferences in a variety of ways. Rosemary Zion, an attorney, was commissioned by the Center for Women Policy Studies in Washington, D.C., in coordination with the National IWY Committee to publish a booklet on the status of homemakers in Montana. In it, she considered both the real progress which Montana women have made through new legislation in recent years, but the equally real economic considerations which still threaten the security of too many women. By March, you start to see publicity for the regional conferences in local newspapers, and there's a real emphasis on women's issues broadly conceived, right? The issues that are facing rural women in the state, the issues that are facing homemakers, like Rosemary Zion pointed out, economic issues, legal issues, issues about women in education, these kinds of things. There's not much emphasis on what we would think of as kind of radical or liberal feminist issues. One of the interesting things I found that I'll just make a side note here is that all of these little articles publicizing the regional conferences are very much sidelined by newspapers in the state. They clearly are not thinking about this as something important, certainly not something that is front page news. All of these little articles are nestled in between recipes for bundt cakes and Dear Abby columns, right? They are very much relegated to the women's pages. So clearly the newspapers are not conceiving this as something big and political at this moment either. We also see that local networks are really important for advertising the local regional conventions, word of mouth, posters, flyers, this one here from the Wolf Point Convention. There's a lot of emphasis too about diversity. One of the requirements from the National IWI Commission is that the delegations reflect the diversity of the state that they're representing, and so there is real emphasis on trying to bring as many women to the table as possible. The regional conferences, by all accounts, are a smashing success. There's a real mixture of business and entertainment and networking and serious conversations. There's workshops held on things like women's banking and credit issues, women in the military. There's talks delivered by experts on topics like women's status globally, or the history of women in Montana, for instance. Rosemary Zion, who wrote that pamphlet on homemakers in the state, gives talks at many of these regional conferences. Again, there's a real emphasis on accessibility. Many of the conferences offer free childcare for women. Some of them, like the one in Wolf Point, even offer free accommodations for women who are traveling in from out of town. So there's definitely a lot of interesting conversations that are happening, and according to the polls that they did at the conferences, the women who attend felt like they really got something out of these regional conferences, that they were educated, that they had meaningful conversations, interesting debates. Maybe not everybody agreed, but there was a real sense of unity prevailing at these regional conferences. The one that received the most publicity was the regional conference held in Billings. One of the featured speakers was Belle Weinstein. Don't you love this picture? She's pictured here with Fran Elge, who was the regional committee coordinator for the Billings area. Weinstein was called No Modern Liber by the Billings Gazette. Although she had really long women's rights credentials behind her. She served as an aide to Jeanette Rankin in 1917. She was an ardent suffragist and a proponent of the Equal Rights Amendment. The Billings Gazette talked about her coming in to deliver her speech, dressed in a red suit with a gold ribbon in her hair and a gold scarf around her neck. Belle talked about her long battle for women's rights and why it's important for women to have a seat at the table. She said, "It isn't that women see any more clearly than men, but they're more impatient to get things done once they see what's wrong." She would go on in this speech to talk about the Equal Rights Amendment, which she had been supporting since it was first introduced in 1923. She elaborated on some of the growing criticisms that the National Women's Conference was beginning to incite amongst conservatives in the state and nationwide. She said, "I'm hearing the same arguments now that I heard in 1914 from the people who opposed suffrage. All the talk about the family going to the dogs and the home falling apart. Women's voting rights didn't destroy the family. Equal rights for women won't either." Now, she really tapped into an increasing thread of controversy that the International Women's Year and its state conferences were beginning to incite. Nationally syndicated columnist James Kilpatrick published an article in late March about what he dubbed Bella's $5 million boondoggle. When Jimmy Carter had reconstituted the National Commission on the Observation of IWI, he had named Bella Abzug chairperson. She was a hugely divisive figure. She was deemed to be too radical, too feminist, and too politically biased to be put in such a position. So, although the ostensible goal of the National Women's Conference was to identify barriers to women's participation in public life in the United States, Kilpatrick saw something different at work. He said, "This commission will be spending our money in a desperate, last-ditch lobbying effort for the pending Equal Rights Amendment." He charged the commission with political partisanship, extreme liberalism, and most damning, an illegal use of taxpayer funds to promote the ratification of a constitutional amendment. Although folks in Montana, including the editor of the Great Falls Tribune, were optimistic that the Montana Convention would prove those theories incorrect, these ideas are taken up by a group of women in the state. By early June, a group known as the Citizens Review Committee for IWI issued a press release. They charged the Montana International Women's Year Coordinating Committee with misusing federal funds to support the Equal Rights Amendment, and they take it a step farther. They also charge the state IWI committee with supporting, and I quote here, abortion on demand. Led by Joan Zermir, a self-identified homemaker who also served as the state director of Eagle Forum, the director of Central Montana's chapter of Right to Life, and the state chairman of the Montana chapter to Stop ERA. This is really indicative of the growing politicization that we are seeing surrounding the IWI. Although, you know, the state coordinating committee says, oh, no, we're just talking about women's economic issues, we're talking about homemakers, rural women, education, these kinds of things. This is the rhetoric that gets repeated. Zermir echoes Kilpatrick's claims that the state coordinated committee was corrupt, that it was biased, and that it was using taxpayer dollars to finance pro-equal rights positions. And the evidence for this was Belle Weinstein's speech that she gave at the Billings Regional Conference on the Equal Rights Amendment. They also looked to that pamphlet that had been put out by the National Committee. Remember, I said, remember this comes back up. Remember, they had put forth 16 potential planks to be investigated at the state level, and one of those had to do with reproductive justice and freedom. And so Joan Zermir denounces this as evidence that the IWI is lobbying for very political positions. She says this is truly shocking. Federal funds, our own hard-earned tax dollars, are being used to promote the killing of unborn children. And I'm sorry, I realize this is not as lighthearted as yesterday's breakfast talk, but I hope you find it as compelling. Again, the state coordinating committee is looking at these charges and really trying to prove that the outcomes of this conference are not predetermined. Yes, there's a set of issues that they are looking to investigate, and there are prepared workshops on a variety of issues from employment, education, to women's health, and yes, the Equal Rights Amendment. But they really want to make sure that all voices are heard. Mary Hempelman, vice chairman of the state coordinating committee, said that the state meeting is open to all Montanans who want to share their ideas. The only viewpoints that will end up excluded will be the viewpoints of those who choose to exclude themselves. So despite this, despite attempts to reach out kind of across the political aisle, they also start to face some blowback from other women who are worried that their voices are not going to be brought to the table. There's mounting concerns from working class women, rural women, and Native American women who felt underrepresented by the liberal white middle class women that they felt were dominating the state conference. A group of Native American women planned a caucus to be held the day before the conference began. Myrna Small Salmon, who's pictured here, was the caucus coordinator, and she noted, Indian women in Montana are unique because we realize our problems cannot be fused into resolutions that will be drawn up by our non-Indian peers. The Indian Women's Caucus also worked with the Montana Migrant Council to recruit Mexican-American women, as well as reaching out to Black women across the state to try to ensure minority and working class representation at the state conference in Helena. Meanwhile, The concerns about misuse of federal funds continue to grow and are snowballing through the coordination of women who are part of organizations like Phyllis Schlafly's Eagle Forum. They start fighting back against what they call big sister government. They really see the International Women's Year as an opportunity to challenge what they see as the dominance of a liberal feminist agenda that's pushing for things that, as they see it, the silent majority don't agree with. So there's a bevy of literature that comes out opposing International Women's Year that circulates across the state. Groups like Eagle Forum, Stop ERA, the John Birch Society also involved in this, and a lot of mobilization of women through religious denominations as well. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Catholic denominations, they really start mobilizing women through these religious networks. One of the most interesting pieces that I came across in the state archives was an audio cassette. This is something that I've never encountered before. We don't have audio cassettes in 1837, so I was really astounded and stunned and excited to have the opportunity to put on some big headphones and sit down and listen to this cassette labeled Talking Letters. This is actually a somewhat famous audio cassette. It was recorded initially by a woman from Oklahoma named Diane Edmondson. She talks about how the IWY was allowing evil to take root, how women's libers and the Equal Rights Amendment would force women to leave their husbands. It would destroy the nuclear family. It would result in communal child rearing. It would mandate the teaching of abortion and homosexuality in the schools. She said, if the IWY conferences go as they have planned, there will be no stopping them. But you see, it doesn't have to turn out this way. The IWY can be stopped, but you have to be the ones who do it. Now, scholars who have worked on the National Women's Conference are familiar with this cassette. I was familiar with this cassette, but what I did not expect to find was after Diane Edmondson finished speaking, another voice chimes on. It is none other than Joan Zermier. She encouraged women in Montana to attend the state conference in person. She gave information about how to register, what to do when they arrived, and how to prepare for the sessions that would be most controversial. She said, let's show them by our numbers how strongly we support God and country. Now, this is the kind of language that we start to see replicated over and over. It's not just concerns about the Equal Rights Amendment anymore, but it's this broader set of concerns about shifts in gender norms, about shifts in family structures, about shifts in sexuality that people are concerned about. And you see this in editorials, letters to the editor that are published across the state, like this one here that talks about the homosexual agenda in the state as part of International Women's Year. Women across the state mobilized in large numbers through these political action groups and especially through their church groups to plan their attendance at the state conference. And more than that, they engaged in rigorous preparations. Anti-ERA activist Vicki Stull talked about how her women's church group got together and had a 2-day crash course on Robert's Rules of Order. Others, like Marilyn Fernelius, a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, said that she was informed about the meeting from friends, and to prepare herself on some simple parliamentary procedure, she studied the national IWY recommendations. She went to workshops on parliamentary procedure, and she really, like many of these conservative women, took the time to prepare themselves in order to make as big an impact at the state conference as they possibly could. There's Marilyn. Now, despite concerns about anti-IWY mobilization, the organizing committee was excited and ready when participants descended upon Carroll College on Friday, July 8th, 1977. The governor had issued a declaration proclaiming it to be Montana Women's Action Week. Over 1,700 folks descended on Helena to participate in this conference. And it really seemed like, as things were unfolding early Friday, that this was going to be another smashing success, just like the regional conferences had been. As the business meeting began to unfold, on that first evening, Friday, however, it became very quickly clear that this was not going to be the simple opening business meeting that organizers had prepared for. The parliamentarian moved for a simple approval and adoption of all the rules as laid out by the organizing committee. Cheryl Olson, president of the Stevensville LDS Relief Society, asked instead that the rules be read individually and voted upon individually. As they began to go through the rules, anti-IWY leaders Joan Zermier, Cheryl Olson, Suzanne Morris began offering amendments designed to give their caucus of conservative women essentially the upper hand in the proceedings that were unfolding. So they offered amendments and passed them through their superior numbers because they had mobilized so effectively, doing things like giving delegates nominated from the floor equal footing with those that had been proposed by the committee. They amended rules governing workshops, basically altering the process, making the women who were intended to run those kind of figureheads. I mean, essentially, they gut the power of the organizing committee and the women who had prepared to run all the sessions. It becomes clear that this is not going according to plan, or at least how the coordinating committee had planned things to go. And many of the women who came to support this process, who really believed in this as an opportunity to discuss issues like the Equal Rights Amendment, felt kind of beleaguered by what they're witnessing here. It became very clear that they were the minority in this room. Linda Jackson of Helena called upon the chair for a point of personal order, expressing the growing dissatisfaction of women who increasingly felt like the meeting was being taken over by those hostile to its intent. Jackson invited all these people who seem to be in the minority, all those individuals who are very dissatisfied with what's been happening so far, to leave and meet in the ballroom right now. They were warned that if they left before the meeting concluded, that business would still be conducted in their absence. After further debates over additional rules, an unidentified participant proposed that an alternative, more democratic IWY meeting be held in a separate location. The women who had left to go convene in the ballroom had drafted and circulated a petition, and they come back into the meeting. And they read this petition out loud, and they call out, and I quote here, "The steamrolling tactics being used by 2 or 3 heavily organized groups, heavily organized and financed, but representing a minority of women in Montana." A meeting that had been scheduled to take an hour and a half dragged on for 6 hours, and before it was finished, hundreds of women walked out in protest. These grim-faced women, as the Helena Independent Record called them, assembled in a Helena park the following day, where they held their own business meetings and workshops in hopes of changing the direction of the conference. They were told that their proceedings wouldn't count, and they were urged by Mary Munger to return, even if their voices were in the minority, to return and participate nonetheless. The meetings that occurred on Saturday, the workshops where they voted on the various planks, all coalesced in a triumph for the conservative coalition. They voted on issues that reflected their concerns about family, about gender, about sexuality. And they also voted in ways that reflect their concerns about federal intrusion, overreach of government. Sunday, they go to elect the delegates, and unsurprisingly, All 14 of the women elected to represent the state of Montana at the National Women's Conference came from this conservative coalition. Another 50 women in the minority walked out again on Sunday after the majority voted down even the right to submit a minority report as part of the official record. There was a lot of angry people at the outcome of this. There was conversations about how this had been unfair, how it had been rigged, how men with walkie-talkies had been ordering women around, had been coordinating women to go from workshop to workshop in order to obtain the outcomes that they had hoped. Some women talked about it in terms of a communist takeover. Some talked about it in terms of a fascist takeover. I don't think either of those terms are probably very accurate, but clearly there's high emotions running through this. Only some of the women in the minority at that point recognized they really hadn't been cheated, they had been outmaneuvered. The conservative coalition had used community meetings to discuss the International Women's Year and the problems with it. They had studied parliamentary procedures. They had mobilized through their church groups. And they had seen this as political. And frankly, they turned out the vote better. Almost immediately following the meeting, we see dozens of editorials and letters to the editor on both sides of the issue. Dozens in the 10 days following the convention, and dozens more in the months leading up to the national conference in November. There's a number of things that women in the minority attempted to do to combat what they felt was an entirely unrepresentative outcome. So they launched some legal challenges. They call out voting irregularities, for instance. They call for the submission of a minority report, that their account be entered into the official record, that it be submitted to the National IWI Commission. And they lobby state legislators, they lobby the representatives to the United States Congress to bring these issues to Washington. And they begin efforts to petition when it's not clear that they're going to have success with any of these other avenues. And this really turns into a very hot button issue, so much so that there were a couple of women in Ravalli County that were setting up a table in the lobby of the local courthouse to collect signatures about submitting a minority report. And they were repeatedly harassed by a Hamilton man to the point where they had to call the police on this guy. So, this really evokes very strong emotions. Meanwhile, the 14 elected delegates representing this conservative coalition use this as an opportunity to have a platform to discuss the issues that are important to them, that propelled them to get involved in this in the first place. Interestingly, I'll note 8 of the 14 traveled as a group to a Stop ERA conference with Phyllis Schlafly in St. Louis. And really, this becomes a great stumping kind of tactic that they can use their position as the official delegates to lobby against the ERA. So they call for rescinding the ERA in the next legislative session. They go and visit all kinds of community groups throughout the state. So this is a picture from 2 of the delegates attended an AAUW meeting in Billings, Montana. They basically use it as an opportunity to talk about Satan, about one world government, some pretty wild conspiracy theory type stuff. And I don't know if any of you have been to like AAUW meetings, but typically they're very enthusiastic. They ask lots of questions. And according to the Billings Gazette's report on this, this group of women sat there, kind of fake smiles plastered on their faces, and then promptly shooed these women out. But nonetheless, you see a number of themes emerge from the op-eds that they publish, from the speeches that they deliver at these community events, themes that the IWI is designed to weaken the family, that it's an overreach of the federal government, that it is an extension of one world government and UN conspiracies. And they also use it as an opportunity to challenge, again, the Equal Rights Amendment, even though MSU conducted a poll that showed 86% of Montana women supported the Equal Rights Amendment. One of the other things that the 14 delegates do during this time is collect signatures for their own petitions, right? They are going to represent the state at the IWI conference, but they don't support the IWI. In fact, what they do support is an alternative conference that is set to be held in Houston at the same exact time as the IWI, that's dubbed a pro-family rally. And so they start collecting signatures that are going to be delivered at the pro-family rally in support of pro-life resolutions. They call for support of a human life amendment, opposition to a federally controlled preschool program. They're talking about Head Start, opposition to the ERA, and opposition to the promotion of homosexuality or prostitution in schools. So really, they use this as an opportunity to talk about these issues, and pretty remarkably successful. They collect over 15,000 signatures in this petitioning campaign. There is recognition, however, that this is not representative of the diversity of the state, that this is not representative of the policy positions of women in the state. And so the National Commission actually adds 2 at-large delegates to represent the state to try to balance this out a little bit. So Mary Munger, who had chaired the state commission, is very pro-Equal Rights Amendment. She is added as an at-large delegate, as is Myrna Small Salmon, the woman who had coordinated that Indian caucus. In November, over 20,000 women convened in Houston, Texas to participate in the National Women's Conference. It's really interesting that 20,000 women, 20,000 participants, the New York Times, the day before the conference opens, highlights 11 women. 2 of those 11 women are from Montana. Right, the controversy that had embroiled the state committee and convention becomes national news. And so they kind of have this interesting article where they pit Jones Vermeer against Myrna Small Salmon and talk about the problems of representation in the state. The 14 elected delegates traveled together. Their travel was fully funded by the state commission. They have matching tote bags, they have matching stickers, they've got big anti-ERA pins that they wear proudly. The 2 at-large delegates, as well as 1 alternative delegate, have to fund their own arrangements. They are not included in the Montana official delegation. They don't sit together on the floor. And the accounts from the women who attended from the state vary according to their political persuasions. The 14 elected delegates feel really overwhelmed by the majority liberal feminist positions that are represented at the National Women's Conference. They don't feel comfortable in this group. They do feel much more comfortable at that pro-family rally that actually drew as many people as the National Women's Conference itself. Ultimately, the delegates from the state of Montana voted almost universally in opposition to all of the planks that were put forth for voting on the floor at the National Women's Conference. The 2 at-large delegates unsurprisingly, support virtually every single plank that was put forth. This is a great image, and thank you to Diana Mara Henry, who was the official photographer at the National Women's Conference. She has graciously allowed me to use this, and so this is Mary Munger and Myrna Small Salmon. I'm not sure who the two women on their side are, although I know this woman here in the ERA sticker, I can't remember her name, but she was apparently the oldest woman to attend the conference, not from Montana, but a figure of some renown. The 14 elected delegates, the conservative coalition, they come back talking about how they were railroaded, how the conference was rigged, how it was unfair, how they were cheated. I mean, the great irony is that they use exactly the same kinds of language that the minority had used at the state conference to talk about this kind of conservative hijacking of the conference. Ultimately, they felt like they didn't get much done. Nothing really was going to change. What was the point of the whole thing? It was, Bella's boondoggle. It was a federally funded fiasco. So how do we talk about the legacy of the National Women's Conference? Scholars who study this in the national context, they say, this is kind of a moment where you see a real split in women's history. It's clear that solidarity and sisterhood maybe isn't as impactful as they had thought. Here in Montana, I would say that there's a correlation to a growing Republican ascendancy in state politics. Despite that, it also ushers in growing momentum for women's grassroots organizing. This is a new publication called The Network. Montana Women's Network is formed specifically to unite women's groups across the state in their organization. And ultimately, it's not just that liberal women are re-energized and mobilizing in response, but I would say that kind of moderate women are pushed to the left as a result of this as well. And ultimately, that groundswell helps defeat the effort to draw back the state's equal rights ratification. Clearly, it's not a momentous triumph for women's rights in the state, but it is the beginning of a rhetorical development, a conversation about politics vis-a-vis gender, vis-a-vis sexuality, the family, that has important implications for state politics today. Thank you.